You were made to worship. You were made to worship God. But the enemy and the perversion of the world and sin is causing you to worship things other than the only thing that deserves worship, the Creator.
Welcome to the Reach College Podcast with your speaker, Pastor Taylor Gabbert.
Anybody in here like buffalo wings? So I'm like a really big fan of buffalo wings, and I don't like Buffalo Wild Wings because they don't have just the classic buffalo wing sauce. You know, like the normal. When you think buffalo wings, that flavor, right? That's my favorite one. That's like, you know, you almost have to go to like cheaper places to get that sauce still, but I love it so much. I mean, I will get it just about any chance I can. I'm a big fan, right? The problem is there's a consequence to eating that sauce. Makes me miserable. Anyone nearby miserable. It's a problem, but I love it. One time I was on a trip, like a business trip, and I was with a buddy, and we were sharing a hotel room. And in the hotel lobby, they had like one of those little snack areas, and I found they had one of those little refrigerators, and in it was the like Tyson Anytizer microwavable buffalo wings. So like, you know, the lowest quality tier of buffalo wing. And I got some. It put a strain on the friendship in the room. And I think what really put a strain on the friendship was not the consequence of that action. It was that the next night I went back and got more of them. And I think at that point it was like, what are you doing to us? But the problem is, like, I will always go back to something that gratifies me immediately, right? Like, regardless of the consequences. That's kind of a problem with all of us in some way, shape, or form. We're in a series on Romans, and last week, as we started Romans, we were in chapter 1 through 17, and we started with Paul's kind of straightforward explanation of the gospel and how the gospel reveals the righteousness of God. He says that the gospel reveals God's plan to make us right with Him, to justify us, right? To bring us into right standing. And today, he's going to explain wrath. Now, I want to talk about that word wrath for a second. There's this image in our heads of wrath, and rightfully, to a certain extent, it's anger. But really, I want you to see wrath as a holy pulling away, as a withdrawal. It's something that God is right in doing. He's right in pulling away from our sin, from pulling away from us while we are in sin. It's actually a righteous act. Both nights that we were in that hotel room, my buddy found a reason to go somewhere else, and I couldn't blame him. See, he was right in pulling away from me. Right now, as we see God's wrath, I don't want you to take out the concept of anger. God is upset with our sin, but you need to understand even why that is. God actually loves us so much that He is upset when we do things that will ultimately hurt us, that will ultimately keep us from being in relationship with Him. That is what makes Him upset. That's what causes His wrath and His pulling away. Now, the next thing you need to understand is the context of wrath in the passage we're going to be in today. This context is not inherently to the individual response to the gospel. It's not talking about how you as a person experience wrath when you reject God's saving grace. That's not what we're talking about. this is almost a retelling of Genesis 1 through 3 from Paul, and he's going to say, this is what happens to all of humanity when the gospel is not present, when there is no gospel, when God's righteousness is not revealed to save us. And he's explaining the urgent need of the gospel, why it's so important, why we need it. Paul is going to start by saying, like a mad person, we love idols. We love things that ultimately take us away from God. We love idols in spite of the fact that they can't love us back, and God does. So we're going to start. I want you to see, we're going to start in verse 18 today of Romans chapter 1. And I want you to keep this in mind. The definition of insanity, right, is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. We have a madness or an insanity when it comes to our sin. We go back to it over and over and over again, and the results don't change, and yet we keep expecting it to be fulfilling or uplifting, and it never is. So look with me at verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of people who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. Okay, so this says that sin reveals wrath. Sin reveals wrath. So we saw last week that the gospel reveals God's righteousness. The gospel reveals God's plan to make us right. So sin reveals wrath, because if there was not sin, then there would be no reason for God to withdraw, to pull back. It's our actions that are sinful that actually show us that God is being wrathful, right? And He does this with all humanity. It says that we suppress the truth. I want you to see in this self-imposed. Self-imposed. Our blindness to God is not because God is not making Himself apparent all the time in nature, in your life. The reason you don't see God is because you have self-imposed a blindness towards Him. And then I want you to see also in these two verses, you've probably heard the phrase, the God-shaped hole. And there's something that we use that phrase to describe this idea that there's something empty inside of us that only God can fill, and we try to put other things in there, but they're not the right shape. They don't fit right. I want to change the shape metaphor of that a little bit. I want you to think of it as a God-sized hole. God is infinite. And so you have an infinite emptiness inside of you that only an infinite God can fill. So when you put things that are finite and limited into that space, it cannot ever reach the limits of this limitless empty space inside of you. Only an infinite and loving God can fill that space. Look at verse 20. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, that is, His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived, being understood by what has been made, so that they are without excuse. Okay, I want you to see what Paul's doing right now. Paul is using something that we call today apologetics. Apologetics is essentially logical and reasonable arguments for the existence of God. Right? It's not special revelation. It's not the things that we know about Jesus and the gospel. It's more of general revelation or natural revelation that there is a God, that God exists, and that's apparent. He references eternal power and divine nature. What are those attributes of God? They're like the most generally apparent. That's not even just apparent to us as the Christian God of the Bible. You can have the concept of an all-powerful God, and He's eternal in power and divine in nature. That's just what we think of when we think of God. Every religion in the world appeals to this deity, this divinity type idea, because it's so apparent to us. It's so obvious that there is an all-powerful being or a creator. What we do now with apologetics is we make certain specific analogies. If you've ever heard the clock and the clockmaker, or the watch and the watchmaker, it's the idea that if you're walking along the beach and you run into a rock and you're like, cool, over billions of years this rock just got here. But if you also ran into a watch, you wouldn't be like, over billions of years the beach just formed this watch. You'd be like, no, somebody somewhere put this together. They made it. And our world is so intricate, and it's so intentional, and it's so purposeful that the more you look into its intricacies, the more you think, somebody made this. Somebody put this all together. God is evident, and because He's evident, there's no excuse for people not believing in Him, for people not acknowledging Him. That's what Paul's saying right here. He says general revelation points to God and leaves us no excuse. Now, this is not, again, special revelation. Jesus says no one comes to the Father except through me, through the gospel, through Him, through Jesus Christ, right? We saw last week that Jesus is the gospel. He's the centerpiece of the gospel. That's the only way to get to God, to get to the Father. But just acknowledging that the Father exists, that's apparent in nature. That's apparent in everything around us. Again, this is not an argument about our ability to respond to the gospel. Paul's actually going to make the case that this is about our inability to respond to God without the gospel. This is why the gospel is so important. This is the fundamental truth. I've told you guys multiple times, there's not Christianity 2.0. There's not like advanced Christianity, like the gospel's just the ticket in the door, and then we can get to all the advanced cool stuff in here. The gospel's the point. Cover to cover the Bible and your entire life. Why? Because even your sanctification, the process by which you grow into Christ likeness, is you responding to the gospel. It's not like you responded to the gospel to get saved and now you get into advanced Christianity so you can grow. That's not it. It's just a deeper and deeper understanding of the gospel that causes us to grow. Okay, look at verse 21. For even though they knew God, they did not honor Him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their reasoning, and their senseless hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible mankind, of birds, four-footed animals, and crawling creatures. They exchanged the glory of God for images, for things that they made. Now, the first thing I want you to see about this is the progression, corruptible man to birds to four-footed animals to crawling creatures. I've called this the bulls to bugs worship, right? It's the idea in Genesis that we had God in His eternal glory, and instead humanity degraded all the way to the point where we're worshiping bugs. We're worshiping the things that crawl on the ground, right? The commandments were given to men to say, don't worship anything but God. Don't worship the bulls. Don't worship the bugs. Worship me. And instead, we progressively have degraded away from God. Now, I want you to understand what worship is. Worship is devotion, right? There's this, we've bought this lie that, the only way you worship something is if you'll, bow down to it or pray to it. And you're like, I don't pray to my Xbox. It's like, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that if you're so devoted to your Xbox that becomes your place of religion, your place of fulfillment and satisfaction, that becomes the thing you're devoted to. But here's the test. Ask yourself, if God told me to give up this, would I do it? And if the answer is no, your devotion is to that. That's the thing that you've built up as an idol and you worship because you're more devoted to that than you are to God. Right? So, and then he says they worshiped things that were made. They gave up the Creator for the created. I was trying to think this week about the idea of building an idol, about how foolish building an idol is, right? So you're an ancient person and you carve an image out of a piece of wood and you lace it with gold and jewels and then you put it up on a podium and you bow down to it. And I was like, what's the equivalent? In some sense, it'd be like I loved Legos growing up, and it would be like if I built a Lego castle and put it in a glass case and put it up on a podium, and then every day I just sat in front of it and just got all my fulfillment and worth from that castle. Everybody that came by was like, have you seen my castle? My Lego castle? Pretty good, right? And that was the thing that filled me up and made me who I was. It'd be ridiculous. And you see that when I'm talking about Legos. The thing is, we're all doing it with something. We're all worshiping something created in place of our Creator. The thing is, we do this thing where we look at the Bible and we see them worshiping idols and we go, those dumb ancient people. Wow. So glad we're more advanced and sophisticated than they are. Let's talk about us for a second. What are the kind of things we worship? How about your self-image? How about your fashion sense, or whether or not you're in a relationship, or whether or not you're married? Listen, I hate to tell you this. Marriage is a great thing. It's a gift from God. And it is one of the biggest idols in the Christian world. We worship it. The joke, right, is that you're not a real Christian until you get married. And then, you know what happens? We rush into marriage and we find out that in and of itself can't fulfill us. Devoid of God and devoid of Jesus and devoid of our worship of Him and the gospel, marriage isn't going to be good. Marriage is good because it's a gift from God, not in place of Him. Right? And so I want you guys to understand, we're not just inherently doing better, right? We may not carve something out of wood and actually bow on the ground to it, but that doesn't mean we're not worshiping idols, okay? And idols are constantly, in our entire life, competing for our devotion to God. This is why we need the gospel. This is why we need to meditate on the gospel, tell people the gospel. This is why we need to tell each other the gospel. Sometimes the people around you that are saved, they need to hear the gospel again. And if you're not having those conversations with your Christian brothers and sisters about what the gospel is and why it's changing your life, you might not know that they're struggling and they just need to be encouraged with what? The gospel. The thing that causes us to be Christ-like. I want to paint a picture of madness in one more place. You guys have heard me, I reference this all the time. It's one of my favorite things in the Bible. You have this moment where Elijah is on Mount Carmel, and he's going up against the priests of Baal, and they say, we're going to build these 2 altars, and we will figure out whose God can provide, can fulfill. You call on your God to light your altar on fire, and then I'll do it. I'll call on my God to light my altar on fire. And whoever's God does it, that will be the real God. And the point of that moment in the Bible is not that Baal is weaker than Yahweh. The point of that moment in the Bible is that Baal doesn't exist. He can't do anything. He's not real. And that's the thing, is your idols can't fulfill you. They can't provide for you. They are false. The only true God is Yahweh. And one of my favorite lines in the Bible is that Elijah says to the people when it's his turn to go, he says, how long will you stumble like a drunk person back and forth between the options? Pick a God and worship that God. He says, if Yahweh is God, worship Yahweh, right? And that really is, it's become the mantra of my life, even to myself, by the way. Again, this isn't about perfection. You're going to fall. You're going to fail. This isn't about perfection. It's about not choosing your idols. Every time you find an idol, you have to light it on fire. You have to burn it to the ground. It has to go. And choosing Yahweh is not that you never find yourself worshiping an idol. It's that in the moment that you're convicted this is an idol, you will do whatever it takes to burn that idol to the ground and chase Jesus. That is what we're talking about. So now we're going to see how our madness leads to our misery, right? Anyone in here ever had alcohol at all? Gotcha. Sinners. No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. If anyone underage raised their hand, I really am coming for you. No. All right, here's the point. Alcohol, if you've had it, you understand what I'm talking about. There's this illusion that comes with alcohol that it's actually making things better. And eventually, you have enough of it, it makes everything worse. It is a miserable experience when you have a lot of it, right? And the thing about that is, I want you to see in that when you worship an idol, it gives you an immediate kind of sense of gratification, something that maybe, buzzes just right, only to leave you empty and miserable. Let's look at verse 24. Therefore, God gave them up to vile impurity in the lusts of their hearts, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. For they exchanged the truth of God for falsehood and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. God gave them up. I want you to see, we're going to see this 3 times. God gave them up. That phrase is God's wrath. What is God's wrath? It's that He pulls away and He lets sin run its course. Why? Because sin makes us miserable. When God pulls away, He's giving us a taste of the consequences of our actions. I want you to see something. Wrath, in the sense of you experiencing it through your life, it shows up as consequences or discipline. You know what wrath is? Wrath is a baby taste of hell. Wrath is a baby taste of hell. Why? Because hell is going to be the place where God has withdrawn Himself. There will be nothing in hell. Water won't quench thirst. Food won't satisfy hunger. There will be nothing. There will be no sunshine. There will be nothing good that brings joy in hell, because God will have withdrawn from it. And why does God let us taste that on earth? It's the pain response. You lean on a burner and it's hot and you feel pain, and so you immediately pull your hand away. What God is doing is He's letting you taste hell, hoping that you will rear back in pain from your sin and go, I don't want that. That hurts. That's miserable. I don't want the consequences of God pulling away from me. And in that way, here's the reality. Wrath in our lives is merciful. See, because if God didn't let us experience wrath in our lives and we never pulled away from sin, if you were a non-Christian and you never experienced wrath or consequences and you died and went to hell, you'd just wake up one day and it would all be bad. And you would have never had a warning sign, never have known that was coming. Wrath is God's merciful warning that there's something bad ahead of us. And I want you to see what God gives them up to. God gives them up to their desires. See, in James chapter 1, James says that desire, when it's fully grown, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, it gives birth to death. See, our desires are leading us down a road to things that will try to take our life, right? I want you to understand, I'm not going to go down this road 5 or 6 times today to kind of explain it, but if you don't understand how your sin leads to death, physical and spiritual death, I will be glad to explain that to you. Because all of our sin, when it is full born, when it has enslaved us fully, and it's run rampant, it will try to kill you. It will try to kill you physically. It will already have killed you spiritually at that point. Our sin is actively trying to take our lives. God's desire in this moment, as He gives us up to desire, His desire is to entice us to come back to Him. He's still nearby while we're playing with our desires. And He wants us to come find Him. Our desires lead to falsehood. The goal is this: when desire lets you down, seek God. Don't just sulk in the shame of playing with something you shouldn't have played with, right? It's like if I burnt my hand on the stove and then I was just like, I deserve to let my hand just burn now. No, I would run cold water over it. I would put something on it because I would try to heal. Oftentimes when we have the pain response to wrath, we just go, I deserve this. And it's that's not it. You need to seek God in that misery. Think about the story of the prodigal son. The prodigal son has this moment of clarity where he looks up and he's like, my life sucks. This is miserable. I should go back. Right? I should go to someone who loves me. And that's all God's looking for from you. He's letting your sin make you miserable so that you will eventually look up and go, where's God? I hate this. I don't want to be stuck in this. Madness to keep chasing misery instead of God eventually enslaves us. It will take control of our life. So I want you to see that our madness leads to our misery, and our misery leads to our moral rebellion. I'm allergic to cats, and I will never own a cat. I'm miserable just being in people's houses that have cats. And I've actually met people who are allergic to cats and have cats and just like live on Benadryl. And they're just like, no, it's fine. My eyes are always this puffy, even when I'm not next to the cat. Like that's miserable. Like I'm like, why are you so dedicated to this thing that is making your life miserable? Yeah, because it's cute. So I want you to see that there are two responses to the misery that God lets us feel from sin. There's defiance and there's ignorance. And either one of these things is our moral rebellion enslaving us, because both of them lead to consequences. Whether you're defying God in your consequences or you're pretending like it doesn't hurt, just petting that cat, taking more Benadryl, either way, you are suffering those consequences in a rebellion to God. Look at verse 26. For this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for that which is contrary to nature, and likewise the men, too, abandoned natural relations with women and burned in their desire towards one another, males with males committing shameful acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. First, I want you to notice that God gave them again. God pulled back a little bit more, and He gave them over to what this time? It was desire first, now it's passion. God gave them to their passions. See, sin no longer is this tempting desire, this thing that you're kind of interested in. It's now something you're passionate about. It's something you're chasing. In your rebellion, you choose sin and you live in sin. This is what I'm talking about. I'm not, you guys hear me say this phrase all the time. I'm not talking about perfection. This is what I'm talking about. Making sin a passion that you choose over God, over Christ likeness. That is what we're talking about when we talk about living in sin. In this moment, as God gives us over to our passions, He is further away, He's harder to find, and yet, in His mercy, He's all that much more missed. Because as you move from desire to passion, your sin's consequences will be ever more miserable, hopefully jockeying you out of them to say, I need to find God, right? So God pulling back further is designed to make you seek Him more. But it also makes Him that much harder to find because you've begun to be enslaved by your passion. Now, I want to address something. I asked myself this week as I studied this section, 26 and 27, it's talking about homosexuality. And I asked myself this question: why this sin? Why is that the one that He highlights? Because we're going to see in a minute that He gives a list, 21 other sins that He's going to talk about. And I wondered why this is the one He singles out and why it's not grouped in with the rest of the list. And I want you to understand something. The reason that this sin is separated is not because it's worse. It's not because this is the sin that's worse than all the other sins. If you do this sin, you should feel more ashamed than any other sin. That's not why He's singling this one out. He's singling this one out because this is the one we justify the most. And I'm not talking just about homosexuality. I'm talking about sexual sin. This is the one we justify. See, in a minute, we're going to get to a list of sins that actually even the ancient world largely would have agreed with Paul and what he was saying, that these things were bad. He singles this one out because this is the one that we justify. It was justified then, and it's justified now. See, we think it's a uniquely 21st century American problem that there's actually people in the church trying to justify sexual sin. That's not unique to us. The ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks, they were constantly justifying sexual sin. They didn't think it was wrong either. They were saying the exact same propaganda. It's love. It's why we're consenting adults. Why can't we make these decisions ourselves? It was the exact same set of standards then as it is now. It hasn't changed. And Paul is addressing this further, not because he's elevating this sin. He's flying in the face of a culture that says, this is okay. This isn't a big deal. And he's saying, no, God has said that this is sin just like every other sin. And you've become passionate about it. See, I want you to see that when it comes to sexual sin, the bulls to bugs worship is true as well. If you've ever been caught in sexual sin, one thing you'll notice is that it amps itself up. The more you stay in sexual sin, the more intense you need it to be. It's the same with drugs. If you've ever been caught up in a sin with drugs, as you take a certain drug, you need bigger and bigger hits more and more often, because it's the only way to keep the high, to try to fulfill what? The infinite God-sized hole inside of you. And so you always need more of it. It's the bulls to bugs worship because it's degrading you instead from worshiping the glory of God, all the way to the point where you're worshiping the worst parts of humanity. The things that make us subhuman, that take away what God has given us in our nature to be with Him and to be loved and to be whole. That is the same exact picture. It's not a worse sin, right? But there's this pushback in our culture that says, well, you're making me feel bad about it. You feel bad about your sin? Good. That's a good thing. And listen, if you're struggling with this, I want you to understand, I don't care if it's premarital sex. I don't care if it's same-sex attraction. And I don't care if it's pornography. I want you to feel bad, not because you are a bad person, because I want you to recoil from that sin and go to God. I want you to say, this is hurting me. This is making me miserable. I need the gospel. I don't hate you because you're struggling with sexual sin. I actually want you to be fulfilled, and I know from this book that there's only one thing that will fulfill you. There is not enough porn on the internet to fill you up. But if you read this book, it will fill you. That's what I want you to see about sexual sin. That's why Paul is honing in right here on this. Look at verse 28. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a depraved mind to do things that were not proper. Okay, this is the third time. God gave them up. And I want you to see what He gave them up to this time. It was desire, then it was passion, and now it's depravity. God has given the human race up to its depravity. Now, that word depravity, it's like uninhibited wickedness. It's like the idea of your mind is actively seeking the things that are opposite of God, the things that are hurting you and killing you. Now, I want you to see this in two realities. There's essentially two things that I just want to kind of differentiate between. There is an individual sense to this. If you are walking in sin, you are progressing through this. Once you've reached your misery, you're desiring that thing, you have begun to have a passion for that thing, and then you move into depravity in your mind about that thing. But I want you to understand, every individual person is moving through this at different rates. And even within the individual, you might be moving through this at different rates with different sins. I don't desire all sins the same, and yet there are some that I'm passionate about. There are some that I seek more than others. So as an individual, you can be in different places on different sins in this rate. But I want you to see what Paul's actually trying to say. What he's saying is humanity, apart from the gospel, is invariably and inevitably moving towards depravity. It's the only option. He's saying that without the gospel, we are on a downhill slope, bulls to bugs, and we are moving towards depravity, and there's no way out. Wrath is the only option for humanity apart from the gospel. That is what Paul's trying to say. Why? Because we're in Romans, we're making this case for why the gospel is the only point, the centerpiece to our very existence is the gospel. And he's making that case by saying, apart from the gospel, it's all going downhill. It's getting worse. Look at verse 29. Hold on, because this is going to be a lot of sins, he's just on a rant here, okay? Verse 29. People have been filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, and evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unfeeling, and unmerciful. I think some of you are sitting there just like, I'm good. Disobedient to parents got me. Right? Like, no one in this room has passed that list, right? If you think you've passed that list, come see me. I'll tell you why you haven't passed that list, okay? Now, I want to talk through this section, and I don't want to get super distracted, but here's the thing. I need you guys to understand what the point of preaching is. The point of preaching is to show you the gospel. When you come in here, I have a goal, and that is for you to see the gospel. We went through Judges last semester, and my goal was to find the gospel in one of the darkest books of the Bible in every chapter. And I hope we were successful in that. I hope that you saw the gospel in Judges. If you've ever read Judges before that, you probably had no idea the gospel was in there, right? And the point is to find the gospel in the Bible. So I want you guys to see the gospel, okay? But there's a second, not the primary goal of preaching, but there's a second goal, which is I want to show you how to handle the Bible. I want to show you how you can peel it apart and find truth in it, okay? So I'm going to talk through something today. It's a little bit more tedious than I'd like to do, but I think it's just important for you guys to see that there's depth in here. You may not all have access to a commentary, and I wouldn't suggest Google because you end up finding people with just really crazy ideas. But the point is, as we study the Word of God, we can find deeper and deeper things in it that are still pointing us to the gospel. Okay, this is not just a random list. Paul wasn't just having a brainstorming session, just listing 21 random sins, okay? I want you to see how these are grouped together. Now, I did a lot of research. There's a lot of theories about how this list is broken up and what the different categories are. This is what I found is the most compelling and convincing. What I'm not telling you is, I know for a fact that this is the only right answer. I think that this makes sense, and we're going to walk through it, okay? So the first thing I want you to see is the first four. The first four, unrighteousness leads us to wickedness. Wickedness leads us to greed, and greed makes us evil. Okay, that first group is a general category. It's four generalized terms for sin. Unrighteousness, to not be right with God. Wickedness is a vicious lack of morals. And greed is a desire for more than God gave you. More than God gave you, or more than other people have. Right? Or the desire for what God gave them. Right? And then all of these things he wraps up in this last term. He says, evil, mean, basic, right? He's saying this is just generally being the opposite of God, right? So that first group is general terms for wickedness and evil. Then he gets into the second group. I called this group envy and envy's consequences. So he says envy, which if you think of envy as self-centeredness, what does self-centeredness lead to? Well, it leads to all kinds of things. It leads to murder, or hate for someone else. It leads to strife or causing drama. It leads to deceit and cunning, or lying, trickery, cheating, right? Basically putting yourself first. And it leads to malice, intentional wickedness towards other people. If you are the center of your universe, then murder, strife, deceit, and malice are all in the deck for you. They're all cards that are playable. And I want you to see, we look at things like murder and we're like, well, I would never kill anybody. And Jesus himself is the one who said, if you have looked at somebody in hatred, you're as guilty of murder as if you had actually killed them, right? Why? Because God doesn't judge your actions that come out of you. He's judging your iniquity that's in your heart and in your flesh. So when you look at people hatefully, you are making yourself the center of your universe, and you are guilty of murder. That's what Jesus taught. All right, the next section, this one was a little weird. The guy I read, he said that based on the verb endings in the Greek, I'll take his word for it. He said that based on the word endings in the Greek, the first 6 in this category are actually meant to be paired, and then the last one is in the category with them. And this category, I've called it the I am God category. So let's go through this one. The I am God category. Gossip and slanderers, meant to be put together. That's putting other people down, right? Cutting other people down. haters of God and insolent. This is defiant in your evil and proud of it. Like saying, I'm actually happy that I'm rebelling against God, and I'm proud of myself for being this person. You think of the person in Genesis who, after Cain, he said, I've killed more people than Cain, and if you send me evil, I'll repay it with even more evil, right? He was proud of the evil and the murder in his life. And then the next one is arrogant and boastful. This is self-made, self-righteous, self-sufficient. I want you to think the Pharisees. People who don't need God. They've got it under control. They are in and of themselves good enough to make it. And then the last one, he says, inventors of evil. Now this is the one that ties the entire category together. Inventors of evil are people who are out for control. They're hurtful. Again, that phrase in English doesn't connect, but in the Greek, it basically means someone who's a tyrant. This category is people who have established themselves as their God. And so all of these behaviors flow out of that idea that I'm God now. Okay, and then the last category, I've called this the generational category. The weirdest sin, if you just read through that list in English, really is disobedient to parents. It just kind of seems out of place. You're like we've got murder and we've got like the 3-year-old disobeying their parents. Like I don't see the connection, right? But if you group it in these categories, this is the perfect start to the next category. The generational category is this. People who are disobedient to parents, that sin is represented in people who are disobedient to God's authorities in their life. Okay? I want you to understand something. Is there a time when you should disobey your parents? Yes. That time is when your parents actively tell you to not do what God has told you to do. Okay? Now here's the deal. You're going to play that card. If you're going to disobey your parents because you're saying, I'm going to obey what God has told me to do, you better be right. Do not just whip that card out every time you disagree with your parents. Well, God told me not to clean my room. I don't have to. Like that will not cut it, right? We call that blasphemy, right? Because that's bringing God's name into something where He is not. Okay? That's attributing something to the work of the Spirit that is not the work of the Spirit. Okay? So if you're going to disobey your parents, you better have a true conviction that God has told you to do the opposite of what they're telling you to do. But here's what I want you to see. That category of disobedient to God's given authorities in your life leads us to without understanding or senseless. I want you to think of a spoiled rich kid. Somebody who is selfish, self-centered, and totally blind to what is good or bad in the world. They just gratify their own needs at every moment and don't even consider that might not be good, right? The next thing is untrustworthy or faithless, someone who is a liar. If your word is worthless, do you know what that represents in we used to say the phrase, a man's word is his bond, right? Here's what that means. You have no character. No one can trust even who you are as a person if you are faithless, if you are untrustworthy and a liar. He says unfeeling or loveless. This is someone with no affection but themselves. I want you to notice this one is the exact opposite of Jesus. Jesus loved everyone in the world so much individually that He died for each one of them. And this is someone who only loves themselves. And then he says unmerciful or heartless, someone who is uncaring. That's someone who is interested in only the things that are going to benefit them and really doesn't get these gross sick people away from me kind of person, right? All of those categories flow out of this idea of somebody who just doesn't care what God has to say. Godly authority, out, right? That's why it starts with disobedience to parents. Again, this is not a comprehensive list of sin. It's a pretty good one. But if you think that you made it through that list just unscathed, you have a whole different problem. Okay? So now let's look at verse 32. Verse 32. And although they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. Okay. They live in sin, but worse than that. They live in sin and they deserve death for their sin, right? But not only that, they draw others into sin. They draw others into rebellion. Why is that worse? listen, fine. You drag yourself to hell, but don't take anybody with you. Don't take anybody else into God's wrath with you in your rebellion. And God looks at that and He says, worse than the fact that they're rebelling against me, they're applauding other people doing it. They're dragging other people down to die with them. Again, not about perfection. This is about not choosing and living in madness. This is about going from madness to misery to moral rebellion. We're trying to choose God. At this point, as God has given them over to their depraved mind, He is the furthest away He can be, which hopefully will spawn them to more and more seek Him because they're so miserable. It's this weird paradox where God is further away and harder to find, and yet more and more missed. That's what wrath is doing. It's a merciful act on God's part. Why would I maddeningly chase miserable instead of filling up on the Father? We languish in anxiety, holding on to the idol of control instead of surrendering to the one in control. We can walk in peace, flowing from fountains of faith, or crawl along desert floors, thirsting for defiled waters. Defiance of God is madness. Going mad over loving God dries up tears and takes away sadness. I will worship Him who sets me free, and never the things that suffocate me and take me from His glory. That's what this passage is about. It's about recognizing that our need for the gospel is because our madness is sucking the very thing that's meant to be life in us away from us. You were made to worship. You were made to worship God, but the enemy and the perversion of the world and sin is causing you to worship things other than the only thing that deserves worship, the Creator. The only being who actually deserves your devotion. I want you to see again, this entire section is devoid of the gospel. You want to see the picture of this? Go back and read Judges. That is what's happening in Judges. This bulls to bug degrading of their devotion and their sin away from God in lieu of the gospel. The good news of the gospel is that God is not withdrawing from us. He came to save us in spite of our sin. Don't drift further into your slavery to sin. Don't continue to seek out the things that will never give you a different result than unfulfillment and misery. See the pain that those things are causing you and cry out to God. He wants to save you. Right? You're not worth something to God because you act a certain way. You realize that you're worth something to God, and then you go act a certain way. When you see the gospel and you realize that Jesus loved you individually and came to save you, the response is to go towards Him and away from sin. That's the whole point.
Hey guys, this is Philip Jackson, pastor of Young Adults at Evergreen Baptist Church. I want to invite you to come to Reach. We meet every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. at Evergreen Church in South Tulsa, just east of Mingo on 111th Street. The mission of Reach Tulsa is to cultivate a young adult community that's defined by real transformation and a sincere pursuit of a godly life through training in biblical disciplines, personal development, and intentionally transitioning into independence as mature members of the body of Christ. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like and subscribe to our content. We're available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Reach Young Adult Ministry is a part of Evergreen Baptist Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. For more information and additional lessons, please visit our website, evergreenbc.org.